Welcome back, everyone, to Public Speaking. Today we're going to unveil our first presentation prompt by way of discussing both interpersonal and intrapersonal communication. But first, I'd like to introduce you to my favorite monkey celebrity. His name is Chantec, and he's a 28-year-old living in Zoo, Atlanta. He's been raised like a human child by anthropologist H. Lynn Miles, Ph.D., according to this excerpt from a Reader's Digest article. Chantec learned to use a toilet, clean his room, and receive an allowance which he spent on trips to McDonald's, and I can't blame him. I usually spend my allowance money on fast food. Today he knows over 150 words in sign language and can comprehend spoken language. He might sign bed, sleep, hug if he wants a nighttime hug before going to sleep, and Chantec has even invented new words, signing tomato toothpaste for ketchup and eye drink for contact lens solution. Chantec calls himself an orangutan person to distinguish himself from others. So what has Chantec really accomplished here? Well, most every sentient organism, even some plants, have acceded to what's called objective self-awareness. That is, they are aware that they are alive. And then, as we grow, mature, and develop, most humans accede to something called sapience, or subjective self-awareness. It's where we realize that while other individuals might be objects in our periphery, we're also objects in their periphery as well, and we're not the center of the universe. But hitherto, it was thought that only humans could accede to what's called symbolic self-awareness. And that's the capacity to take existing symbols, images, or ideas and put them together to create new ideas to describe your own environment, observations, and even feelings or emotions. That's exactly what Chantec has done. He's taken two existing words that he already knew, tomato and toothpaste, and put them together to explain ketchup, because he hadn't ever been taught the word for ketchup. For decades, we've already had primates or other captive monkeys that could use sign language, but this is a new development. So what does this all mean for us? Well, by the end of your first speech, you're going to have exercised and demonstrated symbolic self-awareness. Thus, you will conclusively prove that you are more intelligent than an orangutan. But in order to get started with that, we have to first define a very key term for today's lecture, discussion, and unveiling of our presentation prompt. And that is intrapersonal communication. Notice that's not interpersonal. Interpersonal communication is communication between one or more individuals, often in a casual setting. Intrapersonal communication refers to the internal use of language, images, and speech to form your identity or personality. In other words, intrapersonal communication is the study of how we speak to ourselves. Not only what we say to ourselves, but what symbols we use to communicate within our own identities, to form our personalities, our affiliations, etc. So in order to understand that, we need to review the things that we've already talked about in regards to perception and self-awareness. Remember that self-awareness is a conscious reflection of our motives, goals, and values, and oftentimes our awareness can be influenced by things like alarm or repetition. But today we're going to be spending some time discussing self-concept and self-esteem. Now these are two concepts or phrases that are used interchangeably in daily speech, but in communication we distinguish between the two. Self-concept is your perception of your core traits and behaviors, operative on perception, because sometimes we're not fully aware of our full potential. But we are aware of some of our traits. For example, you might describe yourself as funny, intelligent, athletic, or compassionate. Self-esteem, then, is the degree of personal worth or value that you place on your self-concept. So if you do consider yourself to be both intelligent and athletic or attractive, it's likely your self-esteem is relatively high. But if you consider yourself to be boring, unattractive, unintelligent, or clumsy, chances are your self-esteem will reflect that as well. It's important to note that our self-concept doesn't typically change, but our self-esteem can dramatically change even in the course of a given day, depending upon who we affiliate ourselves with. For example, if you consider yourself to be a highly athletic person, then running a scrimmage with your team will likely boost your self-esteem. But in the same breath, if you find yourself in a lab, having to code with a set of group partners, that athleticism might not necessarily be as germane, so your self-esteem is likely to decrease. So you can see already how important our affiliations, or the groups that we associate with, can affect both our self-concept and our self-esteem, and how important it is to affiliate ourselves, at least in part, with individuals that value our core traits and behaviors. Let's put a pin in that, and let me ask you a question. What do you see here? That's right, I thought you would say that. You see dolphins, right? Well, you might see the dolphins now, but if you're over the age of 6 to 7, you might have seen two figures embracing one another. Because, depending upon your age, you'll likely see very different images in this same photograph. Now, that just determines, or rather illustrates, how much our environment and how much our group affinities can influence our perceptions and thus our identities. To illustrate that further, this is a quote by B.R.M. Begdar. Unlike a drop of water which loses its identity when it joins the ocean, people don't lose their being in the society in which they live. Their life is independent. They are born not to the development of the society, but for the development of themselves. And to illustrate this further, I've underlaid this quotation with two juxtaposed images. The first is from the Beijing Olympics, the opening ceremony, in which was exhibited the single largest group of synchronized movement in recorded history, a record breaker, if you will. On the bottom, you see Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, at the Salt Lake City Olympics. And even though his body at the time was riddled with Parkinson's disease, he was still a record holder, the world champion of boxing. Two world record holders being broken here, both in front of Olympics, but both located in very different places and thus very different cultures. Your textbook describes, for example, China, where the Beijing Olympics took place, as a cooperative culture, a place in which the needs of many often outweigh the needs of a few, and success is measured in how cooperatively everyone can be buoyed by new accomplishments or goals. On the bottom, Salt Lake City, the United States, often described as an individualistic culture, where the accomplishments of a single individual can rise the tide of all ships, so to speak. Two different cultures, two different sets of values, exhibiting different behaviors because of that. Again, an illustration of just how much our affiliations can shape our self-concept and our self-esteem or self-worth. So what do you see here? Chances are you might make some assumptions about this person's appearance, but we really can't make many pronouncements about this person's personality or identity just by looking at her. Why? Because that would cause us to make appraisals about an individual's self-concept, as opposed to a group self-concept. We need to distinguish between these two. Our individual self-concept seems to be tied to unseen characteristics, and refers to individual traits, such as the traits that accompany your personality. That means those traits offer a great degree of what are called diversity and polarity. Diversity because while you might have the same traits, focus, or interests as another person, it's very unlikely that there's any other single person on Earth that has the identical traits that you have, all in one neat package. And polarity means that you can change your interests, your traits, or characteristics over time. For example, think about your favorite music, television show, or film from 10 years ago. Is it the same as it is today? Most likely there have been some alterations, and think how likely that's going to change in another decade, 2 decades, or possibly even longer. Now compare that to something called the group self-concept. These tend to be more cooperative characteristics. So if H. Lynn Miles, the social anthropologist, were to follow you if you have a religious affiliation on a Sunday morning, she might see you dressing up for the boss or wearing similar clothes as everyone else, standing up at the same time, singing the same words, etc., etc. So that means that cooperative characteristics of our group self-concept are easier to identify. It also means they're less dynamic than personality. Why? Because, to use a metaphor, you're a single tugboat in an ocean. It's very easy to turn a tugboat around, but a group, especially a large group, could be as large as an ocean liner, comparatively speaking. So it's hard to get them to change cooperatively through consensus. Think about music again. If you do have a religious affiliation, chances are, if you do worship on Sunday, the same songs that you sing are the songs that were sung 20, 30, maybe even 50 or 100 years ago. And that also bespeaks to intra-group and intergroup relationships. Intra-group, and that even informal groups that we belong to, such as our friends, have unique or signature ways of communicating. You probably received a text from a friend at one time or another with a single word that spoke to an inside joke that you shared. A joke that you got that no one else did. Why? Because you belong to that group, and they have unique ways of communicating. Intergroup relationships mean that some groups define themselves by who they are not as much as who they are. Teams wear different colored jerseys. Or cliques might say, we don't like those things, we wear these clothes. We like those things, but not these things, etc., etc. So what do you see here? Chances are you've probably been able to make much faster pronouncements or observations about this group than about that single individual that we looked at. You might be making observations about the kind of music that they listen to, the activities that they join in, etc. Why? Because what we're seeing are evidence of cooperative characteristics, things that they share in common, that allow us to make more broad-based, if not generalizations, then at least observations. So with that in mind, folks, how do you then choose your self-concept? Well, the first thing we tend to ask ourselves is what your most distinctive trait is as a participant whenever you enter new communication settings. Remember, according to our prior lecture and discussion, we often have some apprehension and expectation whenever we don't know what to expect in new communication environments. For example, during my sophomore year of college, I enrolled in a class called The Novels of Jane Austen for a Western Literature credit. The reason I did this is because the previous spring, my girlfriend had persuaded me to do so. Over the summer we broke up, but I was still enrolled in the course, and so was she. And the course was taught by a female professor. And the remainder of the students were all female, which means I was in a class with 14 other females, talking about the novels of Jane Austen. So whether I wanted to or not, my gender was activated for me, and I'll bet you can relate. There's probably been a time in your life where your age, or your gender, or your ethnicity, or your religious background was activated for you in a communication setting because it was your most unique or standout trait in that circumstance. But if we do have a chance to choose what parts of our self-concept we activate, we often ask what's relevant to the setting. You might have voluminous knowledge of thrash metal bands, but chances are you're not going to share your anecdotes at your grandma's boggle tournament, because they just won't care. You also need to ask what traits you're most comfortable channeling, and what feedback you're likely to receive. For example, you probably have that one friend who has an on and off again relationship with someone that they're just not right for. But chances are you've long since given up giving them advice or telling them to stop seeing that person, because you know that they're not going to listen to you anyway. And my guess is that all of us have deliberately decided not to share information or self-disclose about ourselves just because of the apprehension surrounding the circumstance, a party where everybody else knows one another but you, etc. So with that in mind, folks, I'm going to ask you to do a self-concept self-survey. Take a moment and pause this video if you need to grab a scratch piece of paper, something to write with and something to write on, if you haven't done so already. Then, I'd like you to take a moment to list as many groups as which you share several characteristics as possible. Go ahead and pause this video until you've gotten at least 10 groups. I'll wait. Welcome back. Now that you've got those groups, I'd like you to underline or circle those groups with which you have the greatest impact, especially the relationships and the traits that you share with these group members that you're comfortable activating in an array of situations. And now that you've selected those, take another moment to identify all the significant group traits that you share with these individuals. These might be the important characteristics or values that you share, or the meaningful relationships, the names of people. Or you might list, for example, the things you've done with this group, activities, trips, etc. Again, I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and you can pause and return whenever you've done. So now that you've listed as many group traits as possible for that identity, we're going to enroll or unveil your first speech assignment. Most of us know what a selfie is. A selfie is a picture of yourself and often a group of individuals. And I would imagine that if you don't have a selfie of yourself with the group that you've selected, chances are you have a picture of this group or a picture of a group that you share some traits with. So for this speech, you're going to imagine that you're sharing one of your group affiliations with your student peers, using a photo to illustrate and encapsulate its key traits. This identity can be any group to which you belong that can be used to accurately predict your behavior. As a speaker, you'll be uncovering the unseen characteristics of your chosen photo regarding this group to your student peers. Now, each of our presentation prompts is broken down into 4 or 5 main sections. This is part of the overview or purpose and audience that you can read more about online in our Canvas website. The second part of every speech is a step-by-step guide for completing the assignment, and that's the procedure. So what I'd like you to do is reflect, if you haven't already in writing, on how the group concept that you've chosen has been affected by a certain assembly of individuals. And you might consider some or all of the following questions. Did this group cause you to change your mind about an important decision? Are there any pictures you most associate with this group identity? What are the symbols that you would use to signify its core attributes? And how does this exercise help you understand more about this group's identity? And how might you translate this discovery into a speech? So after you've answered some or all of those questions, you need to organize your speech into a brief, and by brief I mean 2 to 3 minute presentation in 3 parts. Now this is an informal presentation, and by informal I mean that, as you can see, it's relatively short in relationship to our formal presentations. You don't have to do any external research for this. As you've already determined, you already know everything you need to know to provide content for this speech. And finally, I'm going to supply you with the organization and structure you need for this presentation. You're just going to pour in your own observations and experiences. The first part of the speech will describe the traits of the group concept. What are its characteristics? The second part of the speech will show how these traits can be observed in the chosen image. You may elect to use your selected image as a prop during the presentation to illustrate key concepts, enhance the style of your speech, and give it structure. And the third part of your speech will reveal how this group identity has contributed to your overall development, and whether or not you regret the ways this social identity has influenced your self-concept. In other words, you can even choose a group that you are affiliated with, but you might not necessarily be proud of at one time in your life. So, there are an abundance of different types of groups that you can choose for this. Probably the most prevalent example is going to be your group of friends that you share different experiences, values, and interests with. This group might be an organization that you belong to, or a group that you've taken a trip with. Maybe you bonded with this group in a special way, and you keep in touch with them on electronically mediated devices, even though you can't see one another day to day. Maybe this group is an assembly of individuals that you've worked with in the past, or maybe you're working with them now. Maybe this is a group of individuals that you just happen to share a unique interest with. Maybe you've only met them once, but you still identify as a part of that group. And maybe you shared an especially special occasion with that assembly. Maybe this group is someone you associate with a monumental or touchstone event in your life, and the picture that you have will signify that as well. Maybe it was just a random encounter that you had with this group of people, but it indelibly affected the rest of your life. Maybe this is a group that no longer exists, because some of the people in the picture are not living anymore, or are just distant from you due to living in another state or city. Maybe this particular picture of this group commemorates a part of who you are, even though you can't be with those same individuals. Of course, if this particular assignment doesn't interest you, all of our speech prompts come with an alternative. And the alternative for this speech is to, rather than symbolically compare your chosen group concept to a picture, the speaker may choose to compare this same group to an object of some sort. The object should not have any innate ties to the group that has been chosen, a pom-pom for a cheerleader squad or a bat for a baseball team, and must be brought to class on the performance date. The speaker must still describe how this group's characteristics resemble the object, and how that group influences their own identity, and how said group identity has contributed to their development. Now note, because we won't be giving this speech in class, you will need to record this speech with the object in question, and you'll still need to compare it symbolically to prove that you've acceded to that symbolic level of self-awareness. Let's talk a little bit about evaluation and compliance. While there are comprehensive evaluation instructions in our online Canvas site, I am choosing not to overwhelm you with those assessment standards. Instead, I'd like to focus on just two elements of evaluation and compliance that I think might preemptive strike a lot of your emails or questions. As stated, the speech should not be memorized. Indeed, none of the speeches that you give this term will need to be memorized, but you should make every effort to engage your audience. An exceptional speech will do more than simply extemporize a series of hastily written bullet points. In addition to articulation and poise, special attention will be given to evidence of rehearsal and revision. So is it apparent to me, the evaluator, that you, the speaker, have sought the opinions of perhaps classmates or roommates or friends to address the basic obstacles of presentation? Have you received elementary feedback on the reception of your presentation? Now let's talk a little bit more about compliance. Because this is a distance learning assignment, the speech must be recorded and submitted to the appropriate Dropbox by the due date, which, in this case, is approximately a week from today. You will need to procure a working digital device that can record your presentation, and a minimum of 4 additional audience members, less your camera operator, must needs be present to perform the assignment. Let me clarify that. Because the minimum number of students that can ever be in a Rose State College course is 5, then that means that you plus 4 other individuals will need to be in the room at the time of your speech, which means you'll need at least 1 camera operator and 3 audience members. Now, if you can make sure that your camera is stationary, that's fine. Then you have 4 audience members. 4 plus you, which is 1, which is 5. But the minimum number is, of course, 5 individuals in the classroom. Your family, friends, and colleagues can be conscripted to comply with this requirement, and they do not have to be enrolled in Rose State College courses. Now, I can appreciate how that might be difficult for some of us, especially if we are distanced from our family or friends. So I have devised a way around this particular problem. But in the meantime, let's look at this style sheet. Time limit, 2 to 3 minutes. Speeches excessively short or long will be evaluated with severity. A 100 to 150 word abstract, which is just a very brief description, not unlike a discussion post, will describe the content and organization of your speech. It will talk about the first, second, and third part of your speech, just to prove that you considered what you're going to speak about before the speech itself. Your speech must conform to the above purpose and audience. Presentations that fail to sufficiently engage this structure will be evaluated with severity, and you may use index cards, any size, whether 3x5 or 4x6, in lieu of memorization. 2 qualifications to that. If you'd like, you can also use a cellular device, since most cellular devices are approximately the size of index cards. But do note, there is a qualitative and quantitative difference between a 4x6 index card and an 8.5x11 sheet of paper. So make sure that you use index cards and not copy paper for your prompt. Finally, your presentation must comply with the performance format. For audience members, digital recording, speaker must stand for delivery where physically able. So, just in case you can't assemble that many audience members, I've also provided a hyperlink in addition to a full description of this assignment for your reference. That hyperlink will be for Wednesday, the 20th of February, 2019. Between 7 and 9 p.m., there are a finite number of slots that are available if you'd like to perform. In order to sign up, just click on the hyperlink and insert your name, your course section, and your email address. That way we'll know you're coming, and I'll know when you're coming. I will announce the location of our presentation at a later juncture, most likely by email, class announcement, or a mixture of the two. Now, this isn't required. It's completely optional, but I do want to give you that option in case you think you need a live audience to assist with this assignment. In the meantime, before emailing me, please do consult with the full purpose audience procedure and especially evaluation and assessment for this assignment. Chances are that answers to your questions can be found by carefully consulting the assignment prompt. But if they're not, you can always use me as a resource via email or our Canvas Dropbox. That's our assignment, folks. Good luck, and I can't wait to see your first speeches.